Chapter 62. This advice, besides being obviously sensible, would end in saving Ernest both time and suspense of mind, so we had no hesitation in adopting it. The case was called on about 11 o'clock, but we got it adjourned till 3, so as to give time for Ernest to set his affairs as straight as he could, and to execute a power of attorney enabling me to act for him as I should think fit while he was in prison. Then all came out about Prior and the College of Spiritual Pathology. Ernest had even greater difficulty in making a clean breast of this than he had had in telling us about Miss Maitland, but he told us all, and the upshot was that he had actually handed over to Prior every halfpenny that he then possessed with no other security than Prior's IOUs for the amount. Ernest, though still declining to believe that Prior could be guilty of dishonorable conduct, was becoming alive to the folly of what he had been doing. He still made sure, however, of recovering, at any rate, the greater part of his property as soon as Prior should have had time to sell. Townley and I were of a different opinion, but we did not say what we thought. It was dreary work waiting all the morning amid such unfamiliar and depressing surroundings. I thought how the psalmist had exclaimed with quiet irony, "One day in thy courts is better than 1,000, and I thought that I could utter a very similar sentiment in respect of the courts in which Townley and I were compelled to loiter. At last, about 3 o'clock the case was called on, and we went round to the part of the court which is reserved for the general public, while Ernest was taken into the prisoner's dock. As soon as he had collected himself sufficiently he recognized the magistrate as the old gentleman who had spoken to him in the train on the day he was leaving school, and saw, or thought he saw, to his great grief, that he too was recognized. Mr. Rotary, for this was our attorney's name, took the line he had proposed. He called no other witnesses than the rector, Townley and myself, and threw himself on the mercy of the magistrate. When he had concluded, the magistrate spoke as follows: "Ernest Pontifex, yours is one of the most painful cases that I have ever had to deal with. You have been singularly favored in your parentage and education. You have had before you the example of blameless parents, who doubtless instilled into you from childhood the enormity of the offense which by your own confession you have committed. You were sent to one of the best public schools in England. It is not likely that in the healthy atmosphere of such a school as Rubborough you can have come across contaminating influences. You were probably, I may say certainly, impressed at school with the heinousness of any attempt to depart from the strictest chastity until such time as you had entered into a state of matrimony. At Cambridge you were shielded from impurity by every obstacle which virtuous and vigilant authorities could devise, and even had the obstacles been fewer, your parents probably took care that your means should not admit of your throwing money away upon abandoned characters. At night proctors patrolled the street and dogged your steps if you tried to go into any hunt where the presence of vice was suspected. By day the females who were admitted within the college walls were selected mainly on the score of age and ugliness. It is hard to see what more can be done for any young man than this. For the last 4 or 5 months you have been a clergyman, and if a single impure thought had still remained within your mind, ordination should have removed it. Nevertheless, not only does it appear that your mind is as impure as though none of the influences to which I have referred had been brought to bear upon it, but it seems as though their only result had been this, that you have not even the common sense to be able to distinguish between a respectable girl and a prostitute. If I were to take a strict view of my duty I should commit you for trial, but in consideration of this being your first offense, I shall deal leniently with you and sentence you to imprisonment with hard labor for 6 calendar months." Townley and I both thought there was a touch of irony in the magistrate's speech, and that he could have given a lighter sentence if he would, but that was neither here nor there. We obtained leave to see Ernest for a few minutes before he was removed to Coldbath Fields, where he was to serve his term, and found him so thankful to have been summarily dealt with that he hardly seemed to care about the miserable plight in which he was to pass the next 6 months. When he came out, he said, he would take what remained of his money, go off to America or Australia and never be heard of more. We left him full of this resolve, I, to write to Theobald, and also to instruct my solicitor to get Ernest's money out of Pryor's hands, and Townley to see the reporters and keep the case out of the newspapers. He was successful as regards all the higher class papers. There was only one journal, and that of the lowest class, which was incorruptible. Chapter 63. I saw my solicitor at once, but when I tried to write to Theobald, I found it better to say I would run down and see him. I therefore proposed this, asking him to meet me at the station, and hinting that I must bring bad news about his son. I knew he would not get my letter more than a couple of hours before I should see him, and thought the short interval of suspense might break the shock of what I had to say. Never do I remember to have halted more between two opinions than on my journey to Battersby upon this unhappy errand. When I thought of the little sallow-faced lad whom I had remembered years before, of the long and savage cruelty with which he had been treated in childhood, cruelty none the less real for having been due to ignorance and stupidity rather than to deliberate malice, of the atmosphere of lying and self-laudatory hallucination in which he had been brought up, of the readiness the boy had shown to love anything that would be good enough to let him, and of how affection for his parents, unless I am much mistaken, had only died in him because it had been killed anew, again and again and again, each time that it had tried to spring. When I thought of all this I felt as though, if the matter had rested with me, I would have sentenced Theobald and Christina to mental suffering even more severe than that which was about to fall upon them. But on the other hand, when I thought of Theobald's own childhood, of that dreadful old George Pontifex his father, of John and Mrs. John, and of his two sisters, when again I thought of Christina's long years of hope deferred that maketh the heart sick, before she was married, of the life she must have led at Grantsford, and of the surroundings in the midst of which she and her husband both lived at Battersby, I felt as though the wonder was that misfortunes so persistent had not been followed by even graver retribution. Poor people! They had tried to keep their ignorance of the world from themselves by calling it the pursuit of heavenly things, and then shutting their eyes to anything that might give them trouble. A son having been born to them, they had shut his eyes also as far as was practicable. Who could blame them? They had chapter and verse for everything they had either done or left undone. There is no better thumbed precedent than that for being a clergyman and a clergyman's wife. In what respect had they differed from their neighbors? How did their household differ from that of any other clergyman of the better sort from one end of England to the other? Why then should it have been upon them, of all people in the world, that this Tower of Siloam had fallen? Surely it was the Tower of Siloam that was not rather than those who stood under it, it was the system rather than the people that was at fault. If Theobald and his wife had but known more of the world and of the things that are therein, they would have done little harm to anyone. Selfish they would have always been, but not more so than may very well be pardoned, and not more than other people would be. As it was, the case was hopeless. It would be no use their even entering into their mothers' wombs and being born again. They must not only be born again, but they must be born again, each one of them of a new father and of a new mother and of a different line of ancestry for many generations before their minds could become supple enough to learn anew. The only thing to do with them was to humor them and make the best of them till they died, and be thankful when they did so. Theobald got my letter as I had expected, and met me at the station nearest to Battersby. As I walked back with him towards his own house, I broke the news to him as gently as I could. I pretended that the whole thing was in great measure a mistake, and that though Ernest no doubt had had intentions which he ought to have resisted, he had not meant going anything like the length which Miss Maitland supposed. I said we had felt how much appearances were against him, and had not dared to set up this defense before the magistrate, though we had no doubt about its being the true one. Theobald acted with a readier and acuter moral sense than I had given him credit for. "I will have nothing more to do with him," he exclaimed promptly. "I will never see his face again. Do not let him write either to me or to his mother, we know of no such person. Tell him you have seen me, and that from this day forward I shall put him out of my mind as though he had never been born. I have been a good father to him, and his mother idolized him. Selfishness and ingratitude have been the only return we have ever had from him, My hope henceforth must be in my remaining children. I told him how Ernest's fellow curate had got hold of his money, and hinted that he might very likely be penniless, or nearly so, on leaving prison. Theobald did not seem displeased at this, but added soon afterwards, "If this proves to be the case, tell him from me that I will give him £100 if he will tell me through you when he will have it paid, but tell him not to write and thank me, and say that if he attempts to open up direct communication either with his mother or myself, he shall not have a penny of the money." Knowing what I knew, and having determined on violating Miss Pontifex's instructions should the occasion arise, I did not think Ernest would be any the worse for a complete estrangement from his family, so I acquiesced more readily in what Theobald had proposed than that gentleman may have expected. Thinking it better that I should not see Christina, I left Theobald near Battersby and walked back to the station. On my way I was pleased to reflect that Ernest's father was less of a fool than I had taken him to be, and had the greater hopes, therefore, that his son's blunders might be due to postnatal, rather than congenital misfortunes. Accidents which happen to a man before he is born, in the persons of his ancestors, will, if he remembers them at all, leave an indelible impression on him. They will have molded his character so that, do what he will, it is hardly possible for him to escape their consequences. If a man is to enter into the kingdom of heaven, he must do so, not only as a little child, but as a little embryo, or rather as a little zoosperm, and not only this, but as one that has come of zoosperms which have entered into the kingdom of heaven before him for many generations. Accidents which occur for the first time, and belong to the period since a man's last birth, are not, as a general rule, so permanent in their effects, though of course they may sometimes be so. At any rate, I was not displeased at the view which Ernest's father took of the situation. Chapter 64. After Ernest had been sentenced, he was taken back to the cells to wait for the van which should take him to Coldbath Fields, where he was to serve his term. He was still too stunned and dazed by the suddenness with which events had happened during the last 24 hours to be able to realize his position. A great chasm had opened between his past and future, nevertheless he breathed, his pulse beat, he could think and speak. It seemed to him that he ought to be prostrated by the blow that had fallen on him, but he was not prostrated, he had suffered from many smaller lashes far more acutely. It was not until he thought of the pain his disgrace would inflict on his father and mother that he felt how readily he would have given up all he had, rather than have fallen into his present plight. It would break his mother's heart. It must, he knew it would, and it was he who had done this. He had had a headache coming on all the forenoon, but as he thought of his father and mother, his pulse quickened, and the pain in his head suddenly became intense. He could hardly walk to the van, and he found its motion insupportable. On reaching the prison he was too ill to walk without assistance across the hall to the corridor or gallery where prisoners are marshalled on their arrival. The prison warder, seeing at once that he was a clergyman, did not suppose he was shamming, as he might have done in the case of an old jailbird. He therefore sent for the doctor. When this gentleman arrived, Ernest was declared to be suffering from an incipient attack of brain fever, and was taken away to the infirmary. Here he hovered for the next 2 months between life and death, never in full possession of his reason and often delirious, but at last, contrary to the expectation of both doctor and nurse, he began slowly to recover. It is said that those who have been nearly drowned, find the return to consciousness much more painful than the loss of it had been, and so it was with my hero. As he lay helpless and feeble, it seemed to him a refinement of cruelty that he had not died once for all during his delirium. He thought he should still most likely recover only to sink a little later on from shame and sorrow, nevertheless from day to day he mended, though so slowly that he could hardly realize it to himself. One afternoon, however, about 3 weeks after he had regained consciousness, the nurse who tended him, and who had been very kind to him, made some little rallying sally which amused him. He laughed, and as he did so, she clapped her hands and told him he would be a man again. The spark of hope was kindled, and again he wished to live. Almost from that moment his thoughts began to turn less to the horrors of the past, and more to the best way of meeting the future. His worst pain was on behalf of his father and mother, and how he should again face them. It still seemed to him that the best thing both for him and them would be that he should sever himself from them completely, take whatever money he could recover from Prior, and go to some place in the uttermost parts of the earth, where he should never meet anyone who had known him at school or college, and start afresh. Or perhaps he might go to the goldfields in California or Australia, of which such wonderful accounts were then heard. There he might even make his fortune, and return as an old man many years hence, unknown to everyone, and if so, he would live at Cambridge. As he built these castles in the air, the spark of life became a flame, and he longed for health, and for the freedom which, now that so much of his sentence had expired, was not after all very far distant. Then things began to shape themselves more definitely. Whatever happened, he would be a clergyman no longer. It would have been practically impossible for him to have found another curacy, even if he had been so minded, but he was not so minded. He hated the life he had been leading ever since he had begun to read for orders. He could not argue about it, but simply he loathed it and would have no more of it. As he dwelt on the prospect of becoming a layman again, however disgraced, he rejoiced at what had befallen him, and found a blessing in this very imprisonment which had at first seemed such an unspeakable misfortune. Perhaps the shock of so great a change in his surroundings had accelerated changes in his opinions, just as the cocoons of silkworms, when sent in baskets by rail, hatch before their time through the novelty of heat and jolting. But however this may be, his belief in the stories concerning the death, resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ, and hence his faith in all the other Christian miracles, had dropped off him once and forever. The investigation he had made in consequence of Mr. Shaw's rebuke, hurried though it was, had left a deep impression upon him, and now he was well enough to read. He made the New Testament his chief study, going through it in the spirit which Mr. Shaw had desired of him, that is to say, as one who wished neither to believe nor disbelieve, but cared only about finding out whether he ought to believe or no. The more he read in this spirit, the more the balance seemed to lie in favor of unbelief, till, in the end, all further doubt became impossible, and he saw plainly enough that, whatever else might be true, the story that Christ had died, come to life again, and been carried from earth through clouds into the heavens could not now be accepted by unbiased people. It was well he had found it out so soon. In one way or another it was sure to meet him sooner or later. He would probably have seen it years ago if he had not been hoodwinked by people who were paid for hoodwinking him. What should he have done, he asked himself, if he had not made his present discovery till years later when he was more deeply committed to the life of a clergyman? Should he have had the courage to face it, or would he not more probably have evolved some excellent reason for continuing to think as he had thought hitherto? Should he have had the courage to break away even from his present curacy? He thought not, and knew not whether to be more thankful for having been shown his error or for having been caught up and twisted round so that he could hardly err farther, almost at the very moment of his having discovered it. The price he had had to pay for this boon was light as compared with the boon itself. What is too heavy a price to pay for having duty made at once clear and easy of fulfillment instead of very difficult? He was sorry for his father and mother, and he was sorry for Miss Maitland, but he was no longer sorry for himself. It puzzled him, however, that he should not have known how much he had hated being a clergyman till now. He knew that he did not particularly like it, but if anyone had asked him whether he actually hated it, he would have answered no. I suppose people almost always want something external to themselves, to reveal to them their own likes and dislikes. Our most assured likings have for the most part been arrived at neither by introspection nor by any process of conscious reasoning, but by the bounding forth of the heart to welcome the gospel proclaimed to it by another. We hear some say that such and such a thing is thus or thus, and in a moment the train that has been laid within us, but whose presence we knew not, flashes into consciousness and perception. Only a year ago he had bounded forth to welcome Mr. Hawke's sermon, Since then he had bounded after a college of spiritual pathology, now he was in full cry after rationalism pure and simple. How could he be sure that his present state of mind would be more lasting than his previous ones? He could not be certain, but he felt as though he were now on firmer ground than he had ever been before, and no matter how fleeting his present opinions might prove to be, he could not but act according to them till he saw reason to change them. How impossible, he reflected, it would have been for him to do this, if he had remained surrounded by people like his father and mother, or Prior and Prior's friends, and his rector. He had been observing, reflecting, and assimilating all these months with no more consciousness of mental growth than a schoolboy has of growth of body, but should he have been able to admit his growth to himself, and to act up to his increased strength if he had remained in constant close connection with people who assured him solemnly that he was under a hallucination? The combination against him was greater than his unaided strength could have broken through, and he felt doubtful how far any shock less severe than the one from which he was suffering would have sufficed to free him. Chapter 65. As he lay on his bed day after day slowly recovering, he woke up to the fact which most men arrive at sooner or later, I mean that very few care 2 straws about truth, or have any confidence that it is righter and better to believe what is true than what is untrue, even though belief in the untruth may seem at first sight most expedient. Yet it is only these few who can be said to believe anything at all, the rest are simply unbelievers in disguise. Perhaps, after all, these last are right. They have numbers and prosperity on their side. They have all which the rationalist appeals to as his tests of right and wrong. Right, according to him, is what seems right to the majority of sensible, well-to-do people. We know of no safer criterion than this, but what does the decision thus arrived at involve? Simply this, that a conspiracy of silence about things whose truth would be immediately apparent to disinterested inquirers is not only tolerable but righteous on the part of those who profess to be and take money for being par excellence guardians and teachers of truth. Ernest saw no logical escape from this conclusion. He saw that belief on the part of the early Christians in the miraculous nature of Christ's resurrection was explicable, without any supposition of miracle. The explanation lay under the eyes of anyone who chose to take a moderate degree of trouble. It had been put before the world again and again, and there had been no serious attempt to refute it. How was it that Dean Alford, for example, who had made the New Testament his speciality, could not or would not see what was so obvious to Ernest himself? Could it be for any other reason than that he did not want to see it, and if so, was he not a traitor to the cause of truth? Yes. But was he not also a respectable and successful man, and were not the vast majority of respectable and successful men, such for example, as all the bishops and archbishops, doing exactly as Dean Alford did, and did not this make their action right, no matter though it had been cannibalism or infanticide, or even habitual untruthfulness of mind? Monstrous, odious falsehood. Ernest's feeble pulse quickened and his pale face flushed as this hateful view of life presented itself to him in all its logical consistency. It was not the fact of most men being liars that shocked him, that was all right enough, but even the momentary doubt whether the few who were not liars ought not to become liars too. There was no hope left if this were so. If this were so, let him die, the sooner the better. Lord, he exclaimed inwardly, I don't believe one word of it. Strengthen thou and confirm my disbelief. It seemed to him that he could never henceforth see a bishop going to consecration without saying to himself, there, but for the grace of God, went Ernest Pontifex. It was no doing of his. He could not boast. If he had lived in the time of Christ he might himself have been an early Christian, or even an apostle for aught he knew. On the whole he felt that he had much to be thankful for. The conclusion, then, that it might be better to believe error than truth should be ordered out of court at once, no matter by how clear a logic it had been arrived at. But what was the alternative? It was this, that our criterion of truth, that is that truth is what commends itself to the great majority of sensible and successful people, is not infallible. The rule is sound, and covers by far the greater number of cases, but it has its exceptions. He asked himself, what were they? Ah! That was a difficult matter. There were so many, and the rules which governed them were sometimes so subtle, that mistakes always had and always would be made. It was just this that made it impossible to reduce life to an exact science. There was a rough and ready rule of thumb test of truth, and a number of rules as regards exceptions which could be mastered without much trouble, yet there was a residue of cases in which decision was difficult, so difficult that a man had better follow his instinct than attempt to decide them by any process of reasoning. Instinct then is the ultimate court of appeal. And what is instinct? It is a mode of faith in the evidence of things not actually seen. And so my hero returned almost to the point from which he had started originally, namely that the just shall live by faith. And this is what the just, that is to say reasonable people, do as regards those daily affairs of life which most concern them. They settle smaller matters by the exercise of their own deliberation. More important ones, such as the cure of their own bodies and the bodies of those whom they love, the investment of their money, the extrication of their affairs from any serious mess, these things they generally entrust to others of whose capacity they know little save from general report. They act therefore on the strength of faith, not of knowledge. So the English nation entrusts the welfare of its fleet and naval defences to a First Lord of the Admiralty, who, not being a sailor, can know nothing about these matters except by acts of faith. There can be no doubt about faith and not reason being the ultima ratio. Even Euclid, who has laid himself as little open to the charge of credulity as any writer who ever lived, cannot get beyond this. He has no demonstrable first premise. He requires postulates and axioms which transcend demonstration, and without which he can do nothing. His superstructure indeed is demonstration, but his ground is faith. Nor again can he get further than telling a man he is a fool if he persists in differing from him. He says which is absurd, and declines to discuss the matter further. Faith and authority, therefore, prove to be as necessary for him as for anyone else. By faith in what, then, asked Ernest of himself, shall a just man endeavor to live at this present time? He answered to himself, at any rate not by faith in the supernatural element of the Christian religion. And how should he best persuade his fellow countrymen to leave off believing in this supernatural element? Looking at the matter from a practical point of view, he thought the Archbishop of Canterbury afforded the most promising key to the situation. It lay between him and the Pope. The Pope was perhaps best in theory, but in practice the Archbishop of Canterbury would do sufficiently well. If he could only manage to sprinkle a pinch of salt, as it were, on the Archbishop's tail, he might convert the whole Church of England to free thought by a coup de main. There must be an amount of cogency which even an archbishop whose perceptions had never been quickened by imprisonment for assault, would not be able to withstand. When brought face to face with the facts, as he, Ernest, could arrange them, his Grace would have no resource but to admit them. Being an honourable man, he would at once resign his archbishopric, and Christianity would become extinct in England within a few months' time. This, at any rate, was how things ought to be. But all the time Ernest had no confidence in the Archbishop's not hopping off just as the pinch was about to fall on him, and this seemed so unfair that his blood boiled at the thought of it. If this was to be so, he must try if he could not fix him by the judicious use of birdlime or a snare, or throw the salt on his tail from an ambuscade. To do him justice, it was not himself that he greatly cared about. He knew he had been humbugged, and he knew also that the greater part of the ills which had afflicted him were due, indirectly, in chief measure to the influence of Christian teaching. Still, if the mischief had ended with himself, he should have thought little about it, but there was his sister, and his brother Joey, and the hundreds and thousands of young people throughout England whose lives were being blighted through the lies told them by people whose business it was to know better, but who scamped their work and shirked difficulties instead of facing them. It was this which made him think it worthwhile to be angry, and to consider whether he could not at least do something towards saving others from such years of waste and misery as he had had to pass himself. If there was no truth in the miraculous accounts of Christ's death and resurrection, The whole of the religion founded upon the historic truth of those events tumbled to the ground. "My," he exclaimed, with all the arrogance of youth, "they put a gypsy or fortune-teller into prison for getting money out of silly people who think they have supernatural power. Why should they not put a clergyman in prison for pretending that he can absolve sins, or turn bread and wine into the flesh and blood of one who died 2,000 years ago? What," he asked himself, "could be more pure hanky-panky than that a bishop should lay his hands upon a young man and pretend to convey to him the spiritual power to work this miracle?" It was all very well to talk about toleration. Toleration, like everything else, had its limits. Besides, if it was to include the bishop, let it include the fortune-teller too. He would explain all this to the Archbishop of Canterbury by and by, but as he could not get hold of him just now, it occurred to him that he might experimentalize advantageously upon the viler soul of the prison chaplain. It was only those who took the first and most obvious step in their power who ever did great things in the end. So one day, when Mr. Hughes, for this was the chaplain's name, was talking with him, Ernest introduced the question of Christian evidences, and tried to raise a discussion upon them. Mr. Hughes had been very kind to him, but he was more than twice my hero's age, and had long taken the measure of such objections as Ernest tried to put before him. I do not suppose he believed in the actual objective truth of the stories about Christ's resurrection and ascension any more than Ernest did, but he knew that this was a small matter, and that the real issue lay much deeper than this. Mr. Hughes was a man who had been in authority for many years, and he brushed Ernest on one side as if he had been a fly. He did it so well that my hero never ventured to tackle him again, and confined his conversation with him for the future to such matters as what he had better do when he got out of prison, and here Mr. Hughes was ever ready to listen to him with sympathy and kindness. Chapter 66. Ernest was now so far convalescent as to be able to sit up for the greater part of the day. He had been 3 months in prison, and, though not strong enough to leave the infirmary, was beyond all fear of a relapse. He was talking one day with Mr. Hughes about his future, and again expressed his intention of emigrating to Australia or New Zealand with the money he should recover from Prior. Whenever he spoke of this he noticed that Mr. Hughes looked grave and was silent. He had thought that perhaps the chaplain wanted him to return to his profession, and disapproved of his evident anxiety to turn to something else. Now, however, he asked Mr. Hughes point-blank why it was that he disapproved of his idea of emigrating. Mr. Hughes endeavored to evade him, but Ernest was not to be put off. There was something in the chaplain's manner which suggested that he knew more than Ernest did, but did not like to say it. This alarmed him so much that he begged him not to keep him in suspense. After a little hesitation Mr. Hughes, thinking him now strong enough to stand it, broke the news as gently as he could that the whole of Ernest's money had disappeared. The day after my return from Battersby I called on my solicitor, and was told that he had written to Prior, requiring him to refund the monies for which he had given his IOUs. Prior replied that he had given orders to his broker to close his operations, which unfortunately had resulted so far in heavy loss, and that the balance should be paid to my solicitor on the following settling day, then about a week distant. When the time came, we heard nothing from Prior, and going to his lodgings found that he had left with his few effects on the very day after he had heard from us, and had not been seen since. I had heard from Ernest the name of the broker who had been employed, and went at once to see him. He told me Prior had closed all his accounts for cash on the day that Ernest had been sentenced, and had received £2,315, which was all that remained of Ernest's original £5,000. With this he had decamped, nor had we enough clue as to his whereabouts to be able to take any steps to recover the money. There was in fact nothing to be done but to consider the whole as lost. I may say here that neither I nor Ernest ever heard of Prior again, nor have any idea what became of him. This placed me in a difficult position. I knew, of course, that in a few years Ernest would have many times over as much money as he had lost, but I knew also that he did not know this, and feared that the supposed loss of all he had in the world might be more than he could stand when coupled with his other misfortunes. The prison authorities had found Theobald's address from a letter in Ernest's pocket, and had communicated with him more than once concerning his son's illness, but Theobald had not written to me, and I supposed my godson to be in good health. He would be just 24 years old when he left prison, and if I followed out his aunt's instructions, would have to battle with fortune for another 4 years as well as he could. The question before me was whether it was right to let him run so much risk, or whether I should not to some extent transgress my instructions, which there was nothing to prevent my doing if I thought Miss Pontifex would have wished it, and let him have the same sum that he would have recovered from Prior. If my godson had been an older man, and more fixed in any definite groove, this is what I should have done, but he was still very young, and more than commonly unformed for his age. If, again, I had known of his illness, I should not have dared to lay any heavier burden on his back than he had to bear already, but not being uneasy about his health, I thought a few years of roughing it and of experience concerning the importance of not playing tricks with money would do him no harm. So I decided to keep a sharp eye upon him as soon as he came out of prison, and to let him splash about in deep water as best he could till I saw whether he was able to swim, or was about to sink. In the first case I would let him go on swimming till he was nearly 28, when I would prepare him gradually for the good fortune that awaited him. In the second I would hurry up to the rescue. So I wrote to say that Prior had absconded, and that he could have £100 from his father when he came out of prison. I then waited to see what effect these tidings would have, not expecting to receive an answer for 3 months, for I had been told on inquiry that no letter could be received by a prisoner till after he had been 3 months in jail. I also wrote to Theobald and told him of Prior's disappearance. As a matter of fact, when my letter arrived, the governor of the jail read it, and in a case of such importance would have relaxed the rules if Ernest's state had allowed it. His illness prevented this, and the governor left it to the chaplain and the doctor to break the news to him when they thought him strong enough to bear it, which was now the case. In the meantime I received a formal official document saying that my letter had been received and would be communicated to the prisoner in due course. I believe it was simply through a mistake on the part of a clerk that I was not informed of Ernest's illness, but I heard nothing of it till I saw him by his own desire a few days after the chaplain had broken to him the substance of what I had written. Ernest was terribly shocked when he heard of the loss of his money, but his ignorance of the world prevented him from seeing the full extent of the mischief. He had never been in serious want of money yet, and did not know what it meant. In reality, money losses are the hardest to bear of any by those who are old enough to comprehend them. A man can stand being told that he must submit to a severe surgical operation, or that he has some disease which will shortly kill him, or that he will be a cripple or blind for the rest of his life. Dreadful as such tidings must be, we do not find that they unnerve the greater number of mankind. Most men, indeed, go coolly enough even to be hanged, but the strongest quail before financial ruin, and the better men they are, the more complete, as a general rule, is their prostration. Suicide is a common consequence of money losses. It is rarely sought as a means of escape from bodily suffering. If we feel that we have a competence at our backs, so that we can die warm and quietly in our beds, with no need to worry about expense, we live our lives out to the dregs, no matter how excruciating our torments. Job probably felt the loss of his flocks and herds more than that of his wife and family, for he could enjoy his flocks and herds without his family, but not his family, not for long, if he had lost all his money. Loss of money indeed is not only the worst pain in itself, but it is the parent of all others. Let a man have been brought up to a moderate competence, and have no specially, then let his money be suddenly taken from him, and how long is his health likely to survive the change in all his little ways which loss of money will entail? How long again is the esteem and sympathy of friends likely to survive ruin? People may be very sorry for us, but their attitude towards us hitherto has been based upon the supposition that we were situated thus or thus in money matters. When this breaks down, there must be a restatement of the social problem. So far as we are concerned, we have been obtaining esteem under false pretenses. Granted, then, that the three most serious losses which a man can suffer are those affecting money, health and reputation. Loss of money is far the worst, then comes ill health, and then loss of reputation. Loss of reputation is a bad third, for, if a man keeps health and money unimpaired, it will be generally found that his loss of reputation is due to breaches of parvenu conventions only, and not to violations of those older, better established canons whose authority is unquestionable. In this case a man may grow a new reputation as easily as a lobster grows a new claw, or, if he have health and money, may thrive in great peace of mind without any reputation at all. The only chance for a man who has lost his money is that he shall still be young enough to stand uprooting and transplanting without more than temporary derangement, and this I believed my godson still to be. By the prison rules he might receive and send a letter after he had been in jail 3 months, and might also receive one visit from a friend. When he received my letter, he at once asked me to come and see him, which of course I did. I found him very much changed, and still so feeble, that the exertion of coming from the infirmary to the cell in which I was allowed to see him, and the agitation of seeing me were too much for him. At first he quite broke down, and I was so pained at the state in which I found him, that I was on the point of breaking my instructions then and there. I contented myself, however, for the time, with assuring him that I would help him as soon as he came out of prison, and that, when he had made up his mind what he would do, he was to come to me for what money might be necessary, if he could not get it from his father. To make it easier for him I told him that his aunt, on her deathbed, had desired me to do something of this sort should an emergency arise, so that he would only be taking what his aunt had left him. Then, said he, I will not take the £100 from my father, and I will never see him or my mother again. I said, take the £100, Ernest, and as much more as you can get, and then do not see them again if you do not like. This Ernest would not do. If he took money from them, he could not cut them, and he wanted to cut them. I thought my godson would get on a great deal better if he would only have the firmness to do as he proposed, as regards breaking completely with his father and mother, and said so. Then don't you like them? Said he, with a look of surprise. Like them? Said I think they're horrid. Oh, that's the kindest thing of all you have done for me, he exclaimed. I thought all middle-aged people liked my father and mother. He had been about to call me old, but I was only 57, and was not going to have this, so I made a face when I saw him hesitating, which drove him into middle-aged. If you like it, said I will say all your family are horrid except yourself and your Aunt Alethea. The greater part of every family is always odious. If there are 1 or 2 good ones in a very large family, it is as much as can be expected. Thank you, he replied, gratefully. I think I can now stand almost anything. I will come and see you as soon as I come out of jail. Goodbye. For the warder had told us that the time allowed for our interview was at an end. Chapter 67. As soon as Ernest found that he had no money to look to upon leaving prison, he saw that his dreams about emigrating and farming must come to an end, for he knew that he was incapable of working at the plough or with the axe for long together himself. And now it seemed he should have no money to pay anyone else for doing so. It was this that resolved him to part once and for all with his parents. If he had been going abroad he could have kept up relations with them, for they would have been too far off to interfere with him. He knew his father and mother would object to being cut, they would wish to appear kind and forgiving, they would also dislike having no further power to plague him, but he knew also very well that so long as he and they ran in harness together they would be always pulling one way and he another. He wanted to drop the gentleman and go down into the ranks, beginning on the lowest rung of the ladder, where no one would know of his disgrace or mind it if he did know. His father and mother on the other hand would wish him to clutch on to the fag end of gentility at a starvation salary and with no prospect of advancement. Ernest had seen enough in Ashpit Place to know that a tailor, if he did not drink and attended to his business, could earn more money than a clerk or a curate, while much less expense by way of show was required of him. The tailor also had more liberty, and a better chance of rising. Ernest resolved at once, as he had fallen so far, to fall still lower, promptly, gracefully, and with the idea of rising again, rather than cling to the skirts of a respectability which would permit him to exist on sufferance only, and make him pay an utterly extortionate price for an article which he could do better without. He arrived at this result more quickly than he might otherwise have done through remembering something he had once heard his aunt say about kissing the soil. This had impressed him and stuck by him, perhaps by reason of its brevity. When later on he came to know the story of Hercules and Antæus, he found it one of the very few ancient fables which had a hold over him, his chiefest debt to classical literature. His aunt had wanted him to learn carpentering, as a means of kissing the soil should his Hercules ever throw him. It was too late for this now, or he thought it was, but the mode of carrying out his aunt's idea was a detail. There were 100 ways of kissing the soil besides becoming a carpenter. He had told me this during our interview, and I had encouraged him to the utmost of my power. He showed so much more good sense than I had given him credit for that I became comparatively easy about him, and determined to let him play his own game, being always, however, ready to hand in case things went too far wrong. It was not simply because he disliked his father and mother that he wanted to have no more to do with them. If it had been only this he would have put up with them, but a warning voice within told him distinctly enough that if he was clean cut away from them he might still have a chance of success, whereas if they had anything whatever to do with him, or even knew where he was, they would hamper him and in the end ruin him. Absolute independence he believed to be his only chance of very life itself. Over and above this, if this were not enough, Ernest had a faith in his own destiny such as most young men, I suppose, feel, but the grounds of which were not apparent to anyone but himself. Rightly or wrongly, in a quiet way he believed he possessed a strength which, if he were only free to use it in his own way, might do great things some day. He did not know when, nor where, nor how his opportunity was to come, but he never doubted that it would come in spite of all that had happened, and above all else he cherished the hope that he might know how to seize it if it came, for whatever it was it would be something that no one else could do so well as he could. People said there were no dragons and giants for adventurous men to fight with nowadays. It was beginning to dawn upon him that there were just as many now as at any past time. Monstrous as such a faith may seem in one who was qualifying himself for a high mission by a term of imprisonment, he could no more help it than he could help breathing. It was innate in him, and it was even more with a view to this than for other reasons that he wished to sever the connection between himself and his parents, for he knew that if ever the day came in which it should appear that before him too there was a race set in which it might be an honor to have run among the foremost, his father and mother would be the first to let him and hinder him in running it. They had been the first to say that he ought to run such a race. They would also be the first to trip him up if he took them at their word, and then afterwards upbraid him for not having won. Achievement of any kind would be impossible for him unless he was free from those who would be forever dragging him back into the conventional. The conventional had been tried already and had been found wanting. He had an opportunity now, if he chose to take it, of escaping once for all from those who at once tormented him and would hold him earthward should a chance of soaring open before him. He should never have had it but for his imprisonment, but for this the force of habit and routine would have been too strong for him. He should hardly have had it if he had not lost all his money. The gap would not have been so wide but that he might have been inclined to throw a plank across it. He rejoiced now, therefore, over his loss of money as well as over his imprisonment, which had made it more easy for him to follow his truest and most lasting interests. At times he wavered, when he thought of how his mother, who in her way, as he thought, had loved him, would weep and think sadly over him, or how perhaps she might even fall ill and die, and how the blame would rest with him. At these times his resolution was near breaking, but when he found I applauded his design, the voice within, which bade him see his father's and mother's faces no more, grew louder and more persistent. If he could not cut himself adrift from those who he knew would hamper him, when so small an effort was wanted, his dream of a destiny was idle, What was the prospect of £100 from his father in comparison with jeopardy to this? He still felt deeply the pain his disgrace had inflicted upon his father and mother, but he was getting stronger, and reflected that as he had run his chance with them for parents, so they must run theirs with him for a son. He had nearly settled down to this conclusion when he received a letter from his father which made his decision final. If the prison rules had been interpreted strictly, he would not have been allowed to have this letter for another 3 months, as he had already heard from me, but the governor took a lenient view, and considered the letter from me to be a business communication hardly coming under the category of a letter from friends. Theobald's letter therefore was given to his son. It ran as follows: My dear Ernest, my object in writing is not to upbraid you with the disgrace and shame you have inflicted upon your mother and myself, to say nothing of your brother Joey, and your sister. Suffer of course we must, but we know to whom to look in our affliction, and are filled with anxiety rather on your behalf than our own. Your mother is wonderful. She is pretty well in health, and desires me to send you her love. Have you considered your prospects on leaving prison? I understand from Mr. Overton that you have lost the legacy which your grandfather left you, together with all the interest that accrued during your minority, in the course of speculation upon the stock exchange. If you have indeed been guilty of such appalling folly, it is difficult to see what you can turn your hand to, and I suppose you will try to find a clerkship in an office. Your salary will doubtless be low at first, but you have made your bed and must not complain if you have to lie upon it. If you take pains to please your employers, they will not be backward in promoting you. When I first heard from Mr. Overton of the unspeakable calamity which had befallen your mother and myself, I had resolved not to see you again. I am unwilling, however, to have recourse to a measure which would deprive you of your last connecting link with respectable people. Your mother and I will see you as soon as you come out of prison, not at Battersby. We do not wish you to come down here at present, but somewhere else, probably in London. You need not shrink from seeing us, we shall not reproach you. We will then decide about your future. At present our impression is that you will find a fairer start probably in Australia or New Zealand than here, and I am prepared to find you £75 or even if necessary so far as £100 to pay your passage money. Once in the colony you must be dependent upon your own exertions. May Heaven prosper them and you, and restore you to us years hence, a respected member of society. Your affectionate father, T. Pontifex. Then there was a postscript in Christina's writing. My darling, darling boy, pray with me daily and hourly that we may yet again become a happy, united, God-fearing family as we were before this horrible pain fell upon us. Your sorrowing but ever-loving mother, C. P. This letter did not produce the effect on Ernest that it would have done before his imprisonment began. His father and mother thought they could take him up as they had left him off. They forgot the rapidity with which development follows misfortune, if the sufferer is young and of a sound temperament. Ernest made no reply to his father's letter, but his desire for a total break developed into something like a passion. There are orphanages, he exclaimed to himself, for children who have lost their parents. Oh! Why, are there no harbors of refuge for grown men who have not yet lost them? And he brooded over the bliss of Melchizedek, who had been born an orphan, without father, without mother, and without descent. Chapter 68. When I think over all that Ernest told me about his prison meditations, and the conclusions he was drawn to, it occurs to me that in reality he was wanting to do the very last thing which it would have entered into his head to think of wanting. I mean that he was trying to give up father and mother for Christ's sake. He would have said he was giving them up because he thought they hindered him in the pursuit of his truest and most lasting happiness. Granted, but what is this if it is not Christ? What is Christ if he is not this? He who takes the highest and most self-respecting view of his own welfare which it is in his power to conceive, and adheres to it in spite of conventionality, is a Christian whether he knows it and calls himself one, or whether he does not. A rose is not the less a rose because it does not know its own name. What if circumstances had made his duty more easy for him than it would be to most men? That was his luck, as much as it is other people's luck to have other duties made easy for them by accident of birth. Surely if people are born rich or handsome they have a right to their good fortune. Some I know will say that one man has no right to be born with a better constitution than another, others again will say that luck is the only righteous object of human veneration. Both, I dare say, can make out a very good case, but whichever may be right, surely Ernest had as much right to the good luck of finding a duty made easier as he had had to the bad fortune of falling into the scrape which had got him into prison. A man is not to be sneered at for having a trump card in his hand, he is only to be sneered at if he plays his trump card badly. Indeed, I question whether it is ever much harder for anyone to give up father and mother for Christ's sake than it was for Ernest. The relations between the parties will have almost always been severely strained before it comes to this. I doubt whether anyone was ever yet required to give up those to whom he was tenderly attached for a mere matter of conscience. He will have ceased to be tenderly attached to them long before he is called upon to break with them, for differences of opinion concerning any matter of vital importance spring from differences of constitution, and these will already have led to so much other disagreement that the giving up when it comes, is like giving up an aching but very loose and hollow tooth. It is the loss of those whom we are not required to give up for Christ's sake which is really painful to us. Then there is a wrench in Ernest. Happily, no matter how light the task that is demanded from us, it is enough if we do it, we reap our reward, much as though it were a Herculean labor. But to return, the conclusion Ernest came to was that he would be a tailor. He talked the matter over with the chaplain, who told him there was no reason why he should not be able to earn his 6 or 7 shillings a day by the time he came out of prison, if he chose to learn the trade during the remainder of his term, not quite 3 months. The doctor said he was strong enough for this, and that it was about the only thing he was as yet fit for, so he left the infirmary sooner than he would otherwise have done and entered the tailor's shop, overjoyed at the thoughts of seeing his way again, and confident of rising some day if he could only get a firm foothold to start from. Everyone whom he had to do with saw that he did not belong to what are called the criminal classes, and finding him eager to learn and to save trouble always treated him kindly and almost respectfully. He did not find the work irksome, it was far more pleasant than making Latin and Greek verses at Trubborough. He felt that he would rather be here in prison than at Rubborough again, yes, or even at Cambridge itself. The only trouble he was ever in danger of getting into was through exchanging words or looks with the more decent-looking of his fellow prisoners. This was forbidden, but he never missed a chance of breaking the rules in this respect. Any man of his ability who was at the same time anxious to learn would of course make rapid progress, and before he left prison the warder said he was as good a tailor with his 3 months' apprenticeship as many a man was with 12. Ernest had never before been so much praised by any of his teachers. Each day as he grew stronger in health and more accustomed to his surroundings he saw some fresh advantage in his position, an advantage which he had not aimed at, but which had come almost in spite of himself, and he marveled at his own good fortune, which had ordered things so greatly better for him than he could have ordered them for himself. His having lived 6 months in Ashpit Place was a case in point. Things were possible to him which to others like him would be impossible. If such a man as Townley were told he must live henceforth in a house like those in Ashpit Place it would be more than he could stand. Ernest could not have stood it himself if he had gone to live there of compulsion through want of money. It was only because he had felt himself able to run away at any minute that he had not wanted to do so. Now, however, that he had become familiar with life in Ashpit Place he no longer minded it, and could live gladly in lower parts of London than that so long as he could pay his way. It was from no prudence or forethought that he had served this apprenticeship to life among the poor. He had been trying in a feeble way to be thorough in his work, he had not been thorough, the whole thing had been a fiasco, but he had made a little puny effort in the direction of being genuine, and behold, in his hour of need it had been returned to him with a reward far richer than he had deserved. He could not have faced becoming one of the very poor unless he had had such a bridge to conduct him over to them as he had found unwittingly in Ashpit Place. True, there had been drawbacks in the particular house he had chosen, but he need not live in a house where there was a Mr. Holt, and he should no longer be tied to the profession which he so much hated. If there were neither screams nor scripture readings, he could be happy in a garret at 3 shillings a week, such as Miss Maitland lived in. As he thought further, he remembered that all things work together for good to them that love God. Was it possible, he asked himself, that he too, however imperfectly, had been trying to love him? He dared not answer yes, but he would try hard that it should be so. Then there came into his mind that noble air of Handel's, Great God, who yet but darkly known, and he felt it as he had never felt it before. He had lost his faith in Christianity, but his faith in something, he knew not what, but that there was a something as yet but darkly known which made right right and wrong wrong. His faith in this grew stronger and stronger daily. Again there crossed his mind thoughts of the power which he felt to be in him, and of how and where it was to find its vent. The same instinct which had led him to live among the poor because it was the nearest thing to him which he could lay hold of with any clearness came to his assistance here too. He thought of the Australian gold and how those who lived among it had never seen it though it abounded all around them. There is gold everywhere, he exclaimed inwardly, to those who look for it. Might not his opportunity be close upon him if he looked carefully enough at his immediate surroundings? What was his position? He had lost all. Could he not turn his having lost all into an opportunity? Might he not, if he too sought the strength of the Lord, find, like St. Paul, that it was perfected in weakness? He had nothing more to lose, money, friends, character, all were gone for a very long time if not forever, but there was something else also that had taken its flight along with these. I mean the fear of that which man could do unto him. Cantabile vacuus. Who could hurt him more than he had been hurt already? Let him but be able to earn his bread, and he knew of nothing which he dared not venture if it would make the world a happier place for those who were young and lovable. Herein he found so much comfort that he almost wished he had lost his reputation even more completely, for he saw that it was like a man's life which may be found of them that lose it and lost of them that would find it. He should not have had the courage to give up all for Christ's sake, but now Christ had mercifully taken all, and lo! It seemed as though all were found. As the days went slowly by he came to see that Christianity and the denial of Christianity after all met as much as any other extremes do. It was a fight about names, not about things. Practically the Church of Rome, the Church of England, and the freethinker have the same ideal standard and meet in the gentleman, for he is the most perfect saint who is the most perfect gentleman. Then he saw also that it matters little what profession, whether of religion or irreligion, a man may make, provided only he follows it out with charitable inconsistency, and without insisting on it to the bitter end. It is in the uncompromisingness with which dogma is held and not in the dogma or want of dogma that the danger lies. This was the crowning point of the edifice. When he had got here he no longer wished to molest even the Pope. The Archbishop of Canterbury might have hopped about all round him and even picked crumbs out of his hand without running risk of getting a sly sprinkle of salt. That wary prelate himself might perhaps have been of a different opinion, but the robins and thrushes that hop about our lawns are not more needlessly distrustful of the hand that throws them out crumbs of bread in winter, than the Archbishop would have been of my hero. Perhaps he was helped to arrive at the foregoing conclusion by an event which almost thrust inconsistency upon him. A few days after he had left the infirmary the chaplain came to his cell and told him that the prisoner who played the organ in chapel had just finished his sentence and was leaving the prison. He therefore offered the post to Ernest, who he already knew played the organ. Ernest was at first in doubt whether it would be right for him to assist at religious services more than he was actually compelled to do, but the pleasure of playing the organ, and the privileges which the post involved, made him see excellent reasons for not riding consistency to death. Having, then, once introduced an element of inconsistency into his system, he was far too consistent not to be inconsistent consistently, and he lapsed ere long into an amiable indifferentism which to outward appearance differed but little from the indifferentism from which Mr. Hawke had aroused him. By becoming organist he was saved from the treadmill, for which the doctor had said he was unfit as yet, but which he would probably have been put to in due course as soon as he was stronger. He might have escaped the tailor's shop altogether and done only the comparatively light work of attending to the chaplain's rooms if he had liked, but he wanted to learn as much tailoring as he could, and did not therefore take advantage of this offer. He was allowed, however, 2 hours a day in the afternoon for practice. From that moment his prison life ceased to be monotonous, and the remaining 2 months of his sentence slipped by almost as rapidly as they would have done if he had been free. What with music, books, learning his trade, and conversation with the chaplain, who was just the kindly, sensible person that Ernest wanted in order to steady him a little, the days went by so pleasantly that when the time came for him to leave prison, he did so, or thought he did so, not without regret. Chapter 69. In coming to the conclusion that he would sever the connection between himself and his family once for all, Ernest had reckoned without his family. Theobald wanted to be rid of his son, it is true, in so far as he wished him to be no nearer at any rate than the Antipodes, but he had no idea of entirely breaking with him. He knew his son well enough to have a pretty shrewd idea that this was what Ernest would wish himself, and perhaps as much for this reason as for any other he was determined to keep up the connection, provided it did not involve Ernest's coming to Battersby nor any recurring outlay. When the time approached for him to leave prison, his father and mother consulted as to what course they should adopt. "We must never leave him to himself," said Theobald impressively, "we can neither of us wish that." "Oh, no. No. Dearest Theobald," exclaimed Christina. "Whoever else deserts him, and however distant he may be from us, he must still feel that he has parents whose hearts beat with affection for him no matter how cruelly he has pained them." "He has been his own worst enemy," said Theobald. "He has never loved us as we deserved, and now he will be withheld by false shame from wishing to see us. He will avoid us if he can." "Then we must go to him ourselves," said Christina. "Whether he likes it or not, we must be at his side to support him as he enters again upon the world. If we do not want him to give us the slip, we must catch him as he leaves prison. We will. Our faces shall be the first to gladden his eyes as he comes out, and our voices the first to exhort him to return to the paths of virtue." "I think," said Theobald, "if he sees us in the street he will turn round and run away from us. He is intensely selfish. Then we must get leave to go inside the prison, and see him before he gets outside." After a good deal of discussion, this was the plan they decided on adopting, and having so decided, Theobald wrote to the governor of the jail asking whether he could be admitted inside the jail to receive Ernest when his sentence had expired. He received answer in the affirmative, and the pair left Battersby the day before Ernest was to come out of prison. Ernest had not reckoned on this, and was rather surprised on being told a few minutes before 9 that he was to go into the receiving room before he left the prison, as there were visitors waiting to see him. His heart fell, for he guessed who they were, but he screwed up his courage and hastened to the receiving room. There, sure enough, standing at the end of the table nearest the door, were the 2 people whom he regarded as the most dangerous enemies he had in all the world, his father and mother. He could not fly, but he knew that if he wavered he was lost. His mother was crying, but she sprang forward to meet him and clasped him in her arms. "Oh, my boy, she sobbed, and she could say no more. Ernest was as white as a sheet. His heart beat so that he could hardly breathe. He let his mother embrace him, and then withdrawing himself stood silently before her with the tears falling from his eyes. At first he could not speak. For a minute or so the silence on all sides was complete. Then, gathering strength, he said in a low voice, "Mother," it was the first time he had called her anything but Mama, "we must part." On this, turning to the warder, he said, "I believe I am free to leave the prison if I wish to do so. You cannot compel me to remain here longer. Please take me to the gates." Theobald stepped forward. "Ernest, you must not, shall not, Leave us in this way. Do not speak to me, said Ernest, his eyes flashing with a fire that was unwanted in them. Another warder then came up and took Theobald aside, while the first conducted Ernest to the gates. Tell them, said Ernest, from me that they must think of me as one dead, for I am dead to them. Say that my greatest pain is the thought of the disgrace I have inflicted upon them, and that above all things else I will study to avoid paining them hereafter, but say also that if they write to me I will return their letters unopened, and that if they come and see me I will protect myself in whatever way I can. By this time he was at the prison gate, and in another moment was at liberty. After he had got a few steps out he turned his face to the prison wall, leant against it for support, and wept as though his heart would break. Giving up father and mother for Christ's sake was not such an easy matter after all. If a man has been possessed by devils for long enough they will rend him as they leave him, however imperatively they may have been cast out. Ernest did not stay long where he was, for he feared each moment that his father and mother would come out. He pulled himself together and turned into the labyrinth of small streets which opened out in front of him. He had crossed his Rubicon, not perhaps very heroically or dramatically, but then it is only in dramas that people act dramatically. At any rate, by hook or by crook, he had scrambled over, and was out upon the other side. Already he thought of much which he would gladly have said, and blamed his want of presence of mind, but, after all, it mattered very little. Inclined though he was to make very great allowances for his father and mother, he was indignant at their having thrust themselves upon him without warning at a moment when the excitement of leaving prison was already as much as he was fit for. It was a mean advantage to have taken over him, but he was glad they had taken it, for it made him realize more fully than ever that his one chance lay in separating himself completely from them. The morning was grey, and the first signs of winter fog were beginning to show themselves, for it was now the 30th of September. Ernest wore the clothes in which he had entered prison, and was therefore dressed as a clergyman. No one who looked at him would have seen any difference between his present appearance and his appearance 6 months previously. Indeed, as he walked slowly through the dingy crowded lane called Eyre Street Hill, which he well knew, for he had clerical friends in that neighborhood, the months he had passed in prison seemed to drop out of his life, and so powerfully did association carry him away that, finding himself in his old dress and in his old surroundings, he felt dragged back into his old self, as though his 6 months of prison life had been a dream from which he was now waking to take things up as he had left them. This was the effect of unchanged surroundings upon the unchanged part of him. But there was a changed part, and the effect of unchanged surroundings upon this was to make everything seem almost as strange as though he had never had any life but his prison one, and was now born into a new world. All our lives long, every day and every hour, we are engaged in the process of accommodating our changed and unchanged selves to changed and unchanged surroundings, living, in fact, in nothing else than this process of accommodation. When we fail in it a little we are stupid, when we fail flagrantly we are mad, when we suspend it temporarily we sleep, when we give up the attempt altogether we die. In quiet, uneventful lives the changes internal and external are so small that there is little or no strain in the process of fusion and accommodation. In other lives there is great strain, but there is also great fusing and accommodating power, in others great strain with little accommodating power. A life will be successful or not according as the power of accommodation is equal to or unequal to the strain of fusing and adjusting internal and external changes. The trouble is that in the end we shall be driven to admit the unity of the universe so completely as to be compelled to deny that there is either an external or an internal, but must see everything both as external and internal at one and the same time, subject and object, external and internal, being unified as much as everything else. This will knock our whole system over, but then every system has got to be knocked over by something. Much the best way out of this difficulty is to go in for separation between internal and external, subject and object, when we find this convenient, and unity between the same when we find unity convenient. This is illogical, but extremes are alone logical, And they are always absurd. The mean is alone practicable and it is always illogical. It is faith and not logic which is the supreme arbiter. They say all roads lead to Rome, and all philosophies that I have ever seen lead ultimately either to some gross absurdity, or else to the conclusion already more than once insisted on in these pages, that the just shall live by faith, that is to say that sensible people will get through life by rule of thumb as they may interpret it most conveniently without asking too many questions for conscience' sake. Take any fact, and reason upon it to the bitter end, and it will ere long lead to this as the only refuge from some palpable folly. But to return to my story. When Ernest got to the top of the street and looked back, he saw the grimy, sullen walls of his prison filling up the end of it. He paused for a minute or two. There, he said to himself, I was hemmed in by bolts which I could see and touch, here I am barred by others which are none the less real, poverty and ignorance of the world. It was no part of my business to try to break the material bolts of iron and escape from prison, but now that I am free I must surely seek to break these others. He had read somewhere of a prisoner who had made his escape by cutting up his bedstead with an iron spoon. He admired and marveled at the man's mind, but could not even try to imitate him. In the presence of immaterial barriers, however, he was not so easily daunted, and felt as though, even if the bed were iron and the spoon a wooden one, he could find some means of making the wood cut the iron sooner or later. He turned his back upon Eyre Street Hill and walked down Leather Lane into Holborn. Each step he took, each face or object that he knew, helped at once to link him on to the life he had led before his imprisonment, and at the same time to make him feel how completely that imprisonment had cut his life into two parts, the one of which could bear no resemblance to the other. He passed down Fetter Lane into Fleet Street and so to the Temple, to which I had just returned from my summer holiday. It was about 9:30, and I was having my breakfast, when I heard a timid knock at the door and opened it to find Ernest. Chapter 70. I had begun to like him on the night Townley had sent for me, and on the following day I thought he had shaped well. I had liked him also during our interview in prison, and wanted to see more of him, so that I might make up my mind about him. I had lived long enough to know that some men who do great things in the end are not very wise when they are young. Knowing that he would leave prison on the 30th, I had expected him, and, as I had a spare bedroom, pressed him to stay with me, till he could make up his mind what he would do. Being so much older than he was, I anticipated no trouble in getting my own way, but he would not hear of it. The utmost he would assent to was that he should be my guest till he could find a room for himself, which he would set about doing at once. He was still much agitated, but grew better as he ate a breakfast, not of prison fare and in a comfortable room. It pleased me to see the delight he took in all about him, the fireplace with a fire in it, the easy chairs, the Times, my cat, the red geraniums in the window, to say nothing of coffee, bread and butter, sausages, marmalade, etc. Everything was pregnant with the most exquisite pleasure to him. The plane trees were full of leaf still. He kept rising from the breakfast table to admire them. Never till now, he said, had he known what the enjoyment of these things really was. He ate, looked, laughed and cried by turns, with an emotion which I can neither forget nor describe. He told me how his father and mother had lain in wait for him, as he was about to leave prison. I was furious, and applauded him heartily for what he had done. He was very grateful to me for this. Other people, he said, would tell him he ought to think of his father and mother rather than of himself, and it was such a comfort to find someone who saw things as he saw them himself. Even if I had differed from him I should not have said so, but I was of his opinion, and was almost as much obliged to him for seeing things as I saw them, as he to me for doing the same kind office by himself. Cordially as I disliked Theobald and Christina, I was in such a hopeless minority in the opinion I had formed concerning them that it was pleasant to find someone who agreed with me. Then there came an awful moment for both of us. A knock, as of a visitor and not a postman, was heard at my door. "Goodness gracious," I exclaimed, "why didn't we sport the oak? Perhaps it is your father." But surely he would hardly come at this time of day. Go at once into my bedroom. I went to the door, and, sure enough, there were both Theobald and Christina. I could not refuse to let them in and was obliged to listen to their version of the story, which agreed substantially with Ernest's. Christina cried bitterly, Theobald stormed. After about 10 minutes, during which I assured them that I had not the faintest conception where their son was, I dismissed them both. I saw they looked suspiciously upon the manifest signs that someone was breakfasting with me, and parted from me more or less defiantly, but I got rid of them, and poor Ernest came out again, looking white, frightened and upset. He had heard voices, but no more, and did not feel sure that the enemy might not be gaining over me. We sported the oak now, and before long he began to recover. After breakfast, we discussed the situation. I had taken away his wardrobe and books from Mrs. Ju's, but had left his furniture, pictures and piano, giving Mrs. Ju the use of these, so that she might let her room furnished, in lieu of charge for taking care of the furniture. As soon as Ernest heard that his wardrobe was at hand, he got out a suit of clothes he had had before he had been ordained, and put it on at once, much, as I thought, to the improvement of his personal appearance. Then we went into the subject of his finances. He had had £10 from Prior only a day or two before he was apprehended, of which between 7 and 8 were in his purse when he entered the prison. This money was restored to him on leaving. He had always paid cash for whatever he bought, so that there was nothing to be deducted for debts. Besides this, he had his clothes, books and furniture. He could, as I have said, have had £100 from his father if he had chosen to emigrate, but this both Ernest and I, for he brought me round to his opinion, agreed it would be better to decline. This was all he knew of as belonging to him. He said he proposed at once taking an unfurnished top-back attic in as quiet a house as he could find, say at 3 or 4 shillings a week, and looking out for work as a tailor. I did not think it much mattered what he began with, for I felt pretty sure he would ere long find his way to something that suited him, if he could get a start with anything at all. The difficulty was how to get him started. It was not enough that he should be able to cut out and make clothes, that he should have the organs, so to speak, of a tailor. He must be put into a tailor's shop and guided for a little while by someone who knew how and where to help him. The rest of the day he spent in looking for a room, which he soon found, and in familiarizing himself with liberty. In the evening I took him to the Olympic, where Robson was then acting in a burlesque on Macbeth, Mrs. Keeley, if I remember rightly, taking the part of Lady Macbeth. In the scene before the murder, Macbeth had said he could not kill Duncan when he saw his boots upon the landing. Lady Macbeth put a stop to her husband's hesitation by whipping him up under her arm, and carrying him off the stage, kicking and screaming. Ernest laughed till he cried. "What rot Shakespeare is after this," he exclaimed, involuntarily. I remembered his essay on the Greek tragedians, and was more iapris with him than ever. Next day he set about looking for employment, and I did not see him till about 5 o'clock, when he came and said that he had had no success. The same thing happened the next day and the day after that. Wherever he went he was invariably refused and often ordered point blank out of the shop. I could see by the expression of his face, though he said nothing, that he was getting frightened, and began to think I should have to come to the rescue. He said he had made a great many inquiries and had always been told the same story. He found that it was easy to keep on in an old line, but very hard to strike out into a new one. He talked to the fishmonger in Leather Lane, where he went to buy a bloater for his tea, casually as though from curiosity and without any interested motive. "Sell," said the master of the shop, "why nobody wouldn't believe what can be sold by penn'orths and twopenn'orths if you go the right way to work. Look at whelks, for instance. Last Saturday night me and my little Emma here, we sold £7 worth of whelks between 8 and 11:30 o'clock, and almost all in penn'orths and twopenn'orths. A few, ha'porths, but not many. It was the steam that did it. We kept a boiling of 'em hot, and whenever the steam came strong up from the cellar onto the pavement, The people bought, but whenever the steam went down they left off buying, so we boiled them over and over again till they was all sold. That's just where it is. If you know your business you can sell, if you don't you'll soon make a mess of it. Why, but for the steam, I should not have sold tens worth of whelks all the night through. This, and many another yarn of kindred substance which he heard from other people determined Ernest more than ever to stake on tailoring as the one trade about which he knew anything at all. Nevertheless, here were 3 or 4 days gone by and employment seemed as far off as ever. I now did what I ought to have done before, that is to say, I called on my own tailor whom I had dealt with for over a quarter of a century and asked his advice. He declared Ernest's plan to be hopeless. If, said Mr. Larkins, for this was my tailor's name, he had begun at 14, it might have done, but no man of 24 could stand being turned to work into a workshop full of tailors. He would not get on with the men, nor the men with him. You could not expect him to be hail fellow, well met with them, and you could not expect his fellow workmen to like him if he was not. A man must have sunk low through drink or natural taste for low company, before he could get on with those who have had such a different training from his own. Mr. Larkins said a great deal more and wound up by taking me to see the place where his own men worked. This is a paradise, he said, compared to most workshops. What gentleman could stand this air, think you, for a fortnight? I was glad enough to get out of the hot, fetid atmosphere in 5 minutes, and saw that there was no brick of Ernest's prison to be loosened by going and working among tailors in a workshop. Mr. Larkins wound up by saying that even if my protégé were a much better workman than he probably was, no master would give him employment, for fear of creating a bother among the men. I left, feeling that I ought to have thought of all this myself, and was more than ever perplexed as to whether I had not better let my young friend have a few £1,000 and send him out to the colonies, when, on my return home at about 5 o'clock, I found him waiting for me, radiant, and declaring that he had found all he wanted.